In hindsight, it was probably the most defining moment of my life. I was in my early 20s, and I was starting to get excited about my spiritual life and my faith, starting to get active and involved in my church. But one day I found myself in a conversation with my dad, who at that time wasn't really into faith or church at all. And our conversation around my parents' kitchen table was all about why that was. Why was I getting into something that he was so uninto? And so on that particular day, he told me about his day at work that day. Now, my dad was a school administrator, and it was in an era where there was a teacher's labor dispute. And so my dad's job that day, as awkward as it was to kind of mediate the picket line of the striking teachers. And he told me on that particular day, some parents came by. Now, these parents were people who were also really into their faith and engaged in the life of their church. But on that particular day, these parents were driving by, and if you can believe it, they were throwing tomatoes at the striking teachers. They were throwing tomatoes at the striking teachers. And I'll never forget the look on my dad's face as he looked in my eyes and he said, "What would I want anything to do with that?" I didn't realize at the moment that it would be defining for me. All I remember doing was walking out of my parents' kitchen, actually feeling kind of embarrassed that I was even getting into something that I thought could be so good, but was clearly so hurtful to other people. My dad had been such an important influence in my life, and so this idea of what my future was going to become was just kind of crashing down before me. All I could feel in that moment was just, packing it in and throwing in the towel because of the discouragement and the sense of frustration that I was feeling. But there was something inside me that appreciated that there might be a second alternative. There might be a different choice that I could make, and it's that choice that I want to talk to you about today. Now, to be clear, that second choice was not to feel any different than I was feeling. There was no escaping feeling upset about the idea that tomato-throwing Christians didn't make any sense. There was no way to change that feeling of completely agreeing with my dad. The choice wasn't to change my feelings. The choice was what to do with those feelings. Now, quick time out. Have any of you ever experienced those kinds of feelings? You ever felt frustrated or discouraged with something at school that made you just kind of feel like you had no option but to resign yourself to endure it? Ever thrown out a good idea at work only to have it shot down right away and think, well, that's the last time I share any of my ideas? Ever read about someone struggling or suffering in the newspaper and kind of be embarrassed about the community that we live in, but feel like there's nothing else that you can do? Ever been treated poorly by your friends or watch them treat other people poorly and think, maybe it's time to get myself some new friends? Have you ever been so frustrated or discouraged that you felt like your only option was to throw in the towel or just to pack it in? In our day and age, we have a name for that, don't we? It's a name both for that feeling and for the response that goes with that feeling. It's called being done. You ever been done before? Maybe as a younger person, you feel it so strongly, you express it like, I'm so done. What I want us to appreciate, though, today is that people who are done don't change anything. The world never gets changed by people who allow themselves to be done. The world only gets changed by people who make the counterintuitive decision to actually do something in that very moment when they feel most done. That's what it means, after all, to, as Gandhi says, be the change that we want to see in the world. To be change requires first wanting to see change. And wanting to see change requires some level of dissatisfaction or frustration. The challenge, though, is that oftentimes in that dissatisfaction and frustration, we're driven to just kind of throw in the towel and pack it in. And we feel like we have no other alternative. But if we truly want to be the change that we want to see in the world, we need to make that counterintuitive choice. We need to swim against the grain, swim upstream from that gravitational pull to pack it in. And to realize that if we're going to be the change we want to see in the world, we've got to make a different choice than allowing ourselves to be done. You know, a lot of people assume that to be the change in the world requires some kind of grand vision or some imagination or creativity, some picture of the future, which is probably true, but ultimately not the origin of change. Think about Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. You know what he actually said? He said, "I stand before you today, my friends, and in spite of the difficulties and frustrations of the moment, I still have a dream." His dream flowed out of the difficulties and frustrations of the moment. Closer to home, some of us know about Craig Kielburger and his brother Mark and the social enterprise that they launched called Me to We. That social enterprise didn't launch off a dream. Ultimately, it launched off of a 12-year-old Craig Kielburger who was confronted with the reality of child labor and flew himself to India to get a first-hand look. And it was out of that frustration and that dissatisfaction that then birthed that dream. See, vision isn't the first thing that comes. Vision is only the product of when we turn frustration into action. It's the first choice of what to do with our frustration and to do something about it that drives vision for the future. So come back to those feelings that you might have of frustration or discouragement. You know, is there something in the culture, the activity of your student life that you can actually do, that you can contribute instead of just resigning yourself to life as it is? Either formally in student council or in a club, or informally through some kind of initiative or event. You know, can you look at your friends and try to make an investment in the way that you relate instead of just writing off your friendships? Is there something that you can do instead of just resigning yourself to the way it is and allowing yourself to be just done? In my life, I think that that's ultimately what made that defining moment so defining. I knew that I had a choice in front of me. I knew that I could completely agree with my dad that tomato-throwing Christians didn't make any sense. And I could completely give up on the whole idea. Or I could completely agree with my dad that tomato-throwing Christians didn't make any sense, and I could choose to do something about it. I could give the rest of the best of my one and only life to trying to make a difference. Fast forward about 20 years, and for the last almost 2 decades, I've served as the pastor of the church that I grew up in. These days, we're influencing local mayors to become more compassionate cities in a multi-location church community that, among other things, hosts the region's largest homeless shelter in one of our facilities. You know what the coolest part about all of it is? These days, I get to do that along with my dad, who in the last number of years has embraced a faith of his own and is active in his retirement years, serving the homeless and loving on people and showing them what he understands faith ought to look like in a way that's different than throwing tomatoes at people. Lots changed in my life and in our family and even in our community over these last 20 years. But I shudder to think of what it might have all looked like had I just allowed myself to be done. What do you want your world to look like in 20 years? What kind of change would you like to see in the next generation? I want you to realize one thing. People who pack it in do not change the world. People who pack it in do not change the world. Our world only gets changed not by people who are done, but by people who make the counterintuitive choice to actually do something in that moment when they are most done. So in that place, when you find yourself frustrated and discouraged and feel like packing it in, remember that you have a choice. And in that choice, there is a defining moment waiting for each one of you to drive you to become a difference maker like you have never known before. If only you will act on that choice and choose in that very moment when you feel most done to do something. Thanks very much.